Kale always enjoyed the reactions. Being a human at the Intergalactic Academy for Advanced Studies, a place teeming with beings from countless star systems, was an adventure in itself. As Earth's sole representative, he was used to the whispers, the double takes, and the occasional outright gawking. But today, he was aiming to raise the stakes. And based on the stunned silence that greeted him as he entered the lecture hall, he had succeeded. "Is that a panther?" The voice came from somewhere near the back of the room, high-pitched and trembling. Kale paused, letting the door close behind him with a soft hiss. Shadow, the sleek black panther padding at his side, stopped just as silently. Her golden eyes scanned the room, lingering briefly on a nervous-looking reptilian student whose scales shimmered faintly under the overhead lights. Behind Shadow, a fiery red fox trotted in with quick, darting movements, its fluffy tail swaying. A massive wolf, silver-coated and regal, followed them, sniffing the air curiously. Finally, perched on Kale's shoulder, a red-tailed hawk shifted, its talons gripping the reinforced leather of his jacket. The room erupted into chaos. "What are those predators doing here? This is highly irregular. I demand to know if this is permitted." Kale raised both hands in a gesture of calm, though the grin spreading across his face betrayed his amusement. "Relax, everyone. They're just here to help with today's class on interspecies coexistence. Professor Vlix said he wanted more practical applications for this topic, so I thought, what better way than to bring some real-life examples?" At the front of the room, Professor Vlix froze mid-sentence. The insectoid academic was a study in elegance, with a shiny black exoskeleton and antennae that quivered like reeds in the wind. He clutched his datapad as if it were a shield. "Cadet Kale," he began, his mandibles clicking rapidly. "This is highly unorthodox. I did not authorize." Kale cut him off with a winning smile. "I know, Professor, but hear me out. What better way to understand Earth's biodiversity and the unique relationship humans have with their ecosystem than to meet some of its finest ambassadors?" Shadow chose that moment to yawn, her jaws parting to reveal an impressive array of sharp teeth. The mollusk-like student closest to her emitted a high-pitched squeal and promptly slid under their desk. "Ambassadors?" Professor Vlix sputtered, his antennae twitching violently. "These are apex predators from your death world. This is reckless and educational." Kale interjected brightly. "Come on, Professor. Aren't we here to push boundaries and broaden horizons? Besides," he added, scratching the wolf behind its ears, "Fenrir here wouldn't hurt a fly. Would you, boy?" The wolf let out a low, rumbling growl that might have been a purr, or perhaps a warning. It was hard to tell. Professor Vlix glanced around the room, taking in the wide-eyed stares of his students. Finally, with a long, exasperated sigh, he relented. "You have 10 minutes, Cadet Kale. If anything goes wrong, I am holding you personally responsible." Kale beamed. "You won't regret it, Professor." Straightening up, Kale faced the class. "All right, let's start with Shadow here." He gestured to the panther, who had settled into a crouch, her tail flicking lazily. Shadow is a black panther, a type of big cat found in Earth's tropical rainforests. She's what we call an apex predator, which means she's at the very top of the food chain. But don't let that scare you. Panthers are solitary and secretive by nature. They avoid conflict whenever possible. "She doesn't look like she's avoiding conflict now," muttered a crystalline student whose bioluminescent glow had dimmed noticeably. Kale chuckled. "Fair point. Shadow's a bit of an exception because she was raised in captivity. She's used to being around humans and trusts me completely. That's the key here, trust. It's the foundation of any relationship, even one between species as different as humans and panthers." As if on cue, Shadow stretched, her muscles rippling like liquid steel under her glossy coat. The movement was graceful and deliberate, a reminder of her predatory prowess. Several students leaned back in their seats, their discomfort palpable. "Next up, we've got Fenrir." Kale moved to stand beside the massive wolf, who wagged his tail slowly. Wolves are pack animals. They're social creatures with a strong sense of hierarchy and loyalty. Believe it or not, humans and wolves have a shared history going back tens of thousands of years. We domesticated their ancestors to create what you call dogs today. Wait, interrupted a reptilian student with scales that shimmered a nervous green. You mean your species tamed predators like this? Kale nodded. That's right. Humans didn't survive because we were the strongest or fastest. We survived because we learned to work with other species. Wolves helped us hunt, protected our communities, and taught us about teamwork. Fenrir let out a soft huff and sat down, his golden eyes scanning the room with what almost seemed like amusement. The crystalline student hesitated, then extended a glowing appendage toward him. Fenrir sniffed it, then licked it, eliciting a startled laugh. And this little guy, Kale said, scooping up the fox that had been sniffing at a bag of snacks on someone's desk, is Rusty. Foxes are incredibly adaptable and clever. They're known for their problem-solving skills and curiosity. In many ways, they're a lot like humans, always looking for opportunities. Rusty wagged his tail, his bright eyes darting around the room. A few students leaned in closer, their fear gradually giving way to fascination. What about that one? Asked a soft voice. The speaker, a gelatinous alien with shimmering layers, pointed a pseudopod toward the hawk perched on Kale's shoulder. This is Talon, a red-tailed hawk, Kale said, reaching up to stroke the bird's feathers. Birds of prey like hawks are essential for maintaining balance in their ecosystems. They keep populations of smaller animals, like rodents, in check. Without them, the balance would collapse. Talon let out a piercing cry, flapping his wings. The gelatinous alien flinched but didn't retreat. Kale spread his arms, addressing the class as a whole. The point I'm trying to make here is that fear comes from misunderstanding. Yes, these animals are predators. Yes, they're dangerous in the wrong circumstances. But they're also vital to the health of their ecosystems. And when you take the time to understand them, you see their beauty and importance. The room was quiet for a moment, the tension finally beginning to dissipate. A mollusk student cautiously emerged from beneath their desk, their eye stalks focused on Rusty, who was now curled up contentedly in Kale's lap. One of the avian students raised a feathered hand. Do all deathworlders form such bonds with dangerous creatures, or is this unique to your species? Kale grinned. Humans are unique in a lot of ways. We're one of the few species that actively seeks out relationships with other life forms, even those that could harm us. It's part of what makes us, well, human. Professor Vlix cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. While I question your methods, Cadet Kale, I must admit this has been illuminating. Perhaps there is merit in understanding the ecosystems of death worlds, even if the approach is unconventional. Kale gave a mock bow. Thank you, Professor. I'll take that as a compliment. As the class murmured among themselves, the initial fear replaced by curiosity, Kale felt a surge of satisfaction. The lesson wasn't just about the animals. It was about bridging gaps, breaking down barriers, and showing the galaxy that even the most unlikely connections could lead to understanding. Shadow purred softly beside him, as if to say, mission accomplished. Kale noticed a reptilian student, whose scales shifted hues with every passing moment, hovering near Shadow. The student's elongated snout twitched as they hesitantly raised a clawed hand. Cadet Kale, they began, their voice a low hiss. May I approach the predator? Kale gave an encouraging smile. Of course. Just move slowly and let her sniff you first. Shadow's a good judge of character. The reptilian hesitated, but took a tentative step forward. Shadow, lounging lazily, tilted her head and sniffed the air. Her golden eyes locked onto the student, who froze mid-step. For a moment, the room held its breath. Then, with an almost feline sigh, Shadow lowered her head onto her paws, uninterested. She's accepted you, Kale said with a wink. The student blinked, their scales rippling in shades of pale green and yellow. Fascinating. My homeworld has no apex predators. The concept of coexisting with one is unsettling. Kale nodded. I get that. Earth's predators have shaped our evolution in more ways than one. We had to learn how to live alongside them, sometimes by defending ourselves, sometimes by understanding their behavior. Another student, a glowing crystalline being with a soft, melodic voice, chimed in. On our planet, the ecosystem is entirely symbiotic. Predation is unheard of. To see a creature that survives by consuming another is strange to us. Kale gestured to Talon. The hawk perched on his shoulder. I hear you. Predation can seem brutal, but it's part of maintaining balance. Take Talon here. If hawks didn't hunt rodents, those populations would explode and the entire ecosystem would suffer. Predators play a role in keeping everything in check. Talon let out a sharp cry, flapping his wings. The crystalline student flinched but didn't retreat, their glowing appendages dimming slightly. Kale chuckled. Don't worry, he's not hunting anyone today. The mollusk-like student, who had spent most of the lecture hiding under their desk, now emerged fully and slid closer to Rusty. The fox, ever curious, sniffed at the student's gelatinous form before wagging his tail. He doesn't seem dangerous at all, the mollusk said, their voice a soft burble. Kale grinned. Rusty's a charmer, all right. Foxes are like that, clever and adaptable. They've learned to thrive in all sorts of environments, even in human cities. They remind us that survival isn't just about brute strength. It's about intelligence and flexibility. The mollusk extended a pseudopod, which Rusty sniffed before nuzzling affectionately. The mollusk let out a delighted squeak. I see why you call them ambassadors. Professor Vlix, who had been observing the interactions from the sidelines, finally spoke up. Cadet Kale, while I must begrudgingly admit that your demonstration has been educational, I must question the practicality of such relationships. Surely, coexisting with predators on a death world carries significant risks. Kale shrugged, scratching Fenrir behind the ears. The wolf's tail thumped against the floor. Absolutely. But that's what makes it so rewarding. Humans have always had to balance the risks with the rewards. We've learned to respect these creatures, and in doing so, we've found ways to coexist. It's a partnership. The professor tilted his head, his antennae twitching thoughtfully. Your perspective is intriguing. However, it still does not explain why your species would take the additional step of domestication. Why bring predators into your homes? Kale leaned against the desk, his expression thoughtful. Domestication started as a practical thing. Wolves helped us hunt, cats kept pests away, that sort of thing. But over time, it became more than that. These animals became part of our families. They taught us empathy, responsibility, and the value of working together. A feathered avian student raised a wing. Do all humans share this view? Surely some must fear these predators. Kale chuckled. Oh, definitely. Not every human wants to hang out with a. Later that evening, Kale and his animals found themselves in the Academy's observation garden, a sprawling atrium filled with flora from dozens of star systems. It was a tranquil space where students could unwind and reflect, and Kale had often retreated there when he felt the weight of being Earth's only representative. Tonight, however, the space felt different. Shadow prowled along a path lined with glowing bioluminescent ferns from the planet Xyrath. Her movements were graceful and deliberate, each step a reminder of the predatory power coiled within her sleek frame. Fenrir trotted beside her, his ears swiveling at the slightest sound. Talon soared overhead, his sharp eyes scanning for anything of interest, while Rusty darted between alien bushes, sniffing curiously at the unfamiliar scents. Kale smiled as he watched them, his heart swelling with pride. These weren't just animals. They were family, representatives of Earth's resilience, and living symbols of what humans could achieve through understanding and trust. He had just settled onto a bench to relax when the sound of approaching footsteps caught his attention. Turning, he saw a group of students hesitantly entering the garden. Among them were some of the classmates who had been most terrified during his lecture earlier. Cadet Kale? The voice belonged to Lyron, the crystalline student whose glowing body now pulsed with a soft lavender hue. They stepped forward cautiously, their translucent form reflecting the ambient light. "May we join you?" Kale gestured to the empty space around him. Of course. The garden's open to everyone. The group moved closer, though they maintained a respectful distance from the animals. Lyron, emboldened, sat down on a nearby bench. "I've been thinking about what you said today, about trust and coexistence." Kale nodded. "What about it? It's hard for us to imagine. On our planet, cooperation is innate. We don't need to trust because there's no conflict. The idea of living alongside creatures capable of harming you is alien." Kale smiled thoughtfully. "I can see how that would be strange. But for humans, the world's dangers forced us to adapt. We learned to see predators not just as threats, but as teachers and partners. That understanding shaped who we are." Another student, a feathered avian named Orcs, fluttered their wings nervously. "But isn't it dangerous? Even now, sitting here, aren't you afraid one of them might turn on you?" Kale shook his head. "Not at all. I know these animals. I trust them, and they trust me. That bond is what keeps us safe." As if to demonstrate, Rusty trotted over and leapt onto the bench beside Kale, curling up in his lap. The fox's bright eyes scanned the group, his tail swishing lazily. Eric's tilted their head, their feathers ruffling in curiosity. "How do you build that kind of trust?" Lyron asked. Kale scratched Rusty's ears, his voice warm and earnest. "It takes time. You start small, with consistent actions that show you're not a threat. You respect their boundaries and communicate in ways they understand. Over time, trust grows." The mollusk-like student from earlier, whose name Kale had learned was Zoc, inched closer. "Do you think such trust could extend beyond your world? To beings like us?" Kale's smile widened. "I don't see why not. Trust isn't limited by species or origin. It's something you build no matter who or what you are." Shadow chose that moment to approach, her golden eyes fixed on the group. Several students tensed, their fear evident. But Shadow merely sniffed at Lyron before lying down at their feet. Lyron froze, their glow flickering uncertainly. "She likes you," Kale said, his tone light. "If she didn't, she'd just ignore you." Lyron hesitated, then extended a hand toward Shadow. The panther sniffed it briefly before resting her head on her paws. Lyron's glow brightened, a sign of tentative confidence. "This is extraordinary." "It is," Kale agreed. "Moments like this remind me why I wanted to come to the Academy, to share what makes Earth unique and to learn from other worlds in return." Eric's fluttered closer, their gaze flicking between Kale and the animals. "Your world sounds terrifying, but also beautiful. The way you describe it, the danger seems almost worth it." Kale leaned back, his eyes thoughtful. "That's the thing about deathworlds. The danger is real, but so is the beauty. The challenges force life to adapt in incredible ways. Every creature, every ecosystem is a testament to resilience and balance." Zoc burbled softly, their gelatinous form rippling with interest. "Do you think we could learn to form bonds with predators, like you have?" "Absolutely," Kale said. "It's not easy, and it takes patience, but it's possible. The first step is understanding, really learning about the creature and its needs, instincts, and behaviors. Once you do that, the fear starts to fade." The group fell silent, each student lost in thought. Overhead, Talon circled gracefully, his sharp cry echoing through the garden. Shadow purred softly, and Fenrir lay down beside Zoc, his tail wagging faintly. The alien students watched, their expressions a mixture of awe and curiosity. Finally, Lyron spoke. "You've given us much to think about, Cadet Kale. Perhaps our worlds are not as different as they seem." Kale smiled. "I'd like to think so. No matter where we're from, We all have something to learn from each other. And maybe, if we're willing to face the things that scare us, we'll discover something amazing. The group lingered for a while longer, asking questions and observing the animals. By the time they left, the initial fear and hesitation had been replaced by something else: wonder, curiosity, and perhaps even a spark of hope. As the last student disappeared into the garden's shadows, Kale leaned back on the bench, a deep sense of satisfaction settling over him. The day had gone better than he could have hoped. He glanced at Shadow, who stretched luxuriously before curling up beside him. "Good job today," he murmured. Shadow flicked her tail, and Talon landed gracefully on a nearby branch, watching the garden with keen eyes. Fenrir and Rusty settled in beside Kale, their quiet presence a reminder of Earth's untamed spirit. Kale closed his eyes, his thoughts drifting. He had come to the academy to share humanity's story, but tonight he realized he was doing something even more important: building bridges one bond at a time.